Velkomin aftur. Nú ætlum við að fara í enskan viðburð, þannig að ég ætla núna að skipta yfir á ensku. We're going to be having an event now where I'm going to be having a chat with two lovely people who are joining us today. This event is going to be about the queer community and their strategies that are always rapidly changing, and we have to be up to date for the best practices when it comes down to advocacy. Joining me today are Kennedy Walker, who is a campaigner, researcher, and facilitator who first came into change making through grassroots organization in London. He's a co-founded activist and organizer of the network Kin. Nim Ralph is also joining us today, and they have over 15 years of experience in senior leadership and organizational development consultancy. Nim Ralph is a trans activist and freelance writer, trainer, and facilitator. They campaign actively for queer and trans rights, and they organize extensively around issues related to anti-racism, disability, and the environment. I am super excited to welcome them both with us today. Welcome, Kennedy and Nim.
Great. Hi, having us.
Glad to have you with us. We are live now from the Nordic House in Iceland, and I hope a lot of people are watching us today. But maybe I want to ask you both to give us a little bit of an introduction of yourself, what your pronouns are, and from there we'll get into some questions. So maybe we start with you, Nim.
Great. Hi, I'm Nim. My pronouns are they, them. And yeah, I mean, as Ugla said, I'm a trans activist here in the UK. I've been predominantly organising around trans rights here with the rise in a very hostile anti-trans lobby, for want of a better word, in the UK, they're growing and mobilising further afield. So we've had to be very strategic and respond very quickly to changing circumstances. So thanks. It's great to be here. I'm excited for this talk. Thanks for having me.
Great. Thank you, Nim. Kennedy? Yeah.
Yeah, my name's Kennedy. My pronouns are he, him. I'm also based in the UK, and my work kind of intersects with lots of different issues. But the common thread is that I work basically to develop community-led systems and community-led policy in my communities. And I also, through Kin, kind of convene campaigners, activists, and organizers to come together to build relationships, learn from each other, and learn about our radical history. Yeah, I'll leave it there. And I'm really excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Perfect. Thank you both again for being here. So I guess I'm just going to start it off by asking you, what do you think are the biggest challenges for the queer community today, and how might they be different from what they used to be? And maybe think about this both in your local context, but also perhaps a bit more globally. Maybe Nim will want to start.
I think when I first think about how things are different rather than challenges, I think the growth of the internet and social media has radically changed queer community in the last 15 to 20 years. And it keeps changing very quickly and rapidly. And so I think about the impact of that locally and globally, being that in a local sense, we have less and less physical LGBTQ plus spaces, and more that space is found online. And that also has connected us more and more to, I think, global experiences and LGBTQ plus lives. And I think the positive side of that is that it's connected us to understanding how our struggle for rights and liberation is connected to a global struggle and different positionalities of power and rights within that. In terms of the biggest challenges, I think that also the loss of that localized space and infrastructure, and I can really only speak to the UK on that, but it seems like a pretty global, or at least Western phenomenon, is that it's harder to have community. And I think of this word community in the question, what does community mean? And I think sometimes shared identity and shared trauma and pain is something that we call community, but we're not actually in community with each other day to day, in physical spaces, in relationship. And so I think when I think of the biggest challenges, I think some of it is that, some of it is it's much harder to have difficult conversations together when you're not in day-to-day relationship with each other. and that dissolves meaningful community in how we are. And I think in a more global political scale, the biggest challenges we've got are really the big structural issues of racism, transphobia, ableism, poverty in LGBTQ communities.
Yeah. I think maybe to riff a bit off what Nim was saying about not having access to like local spaces and things like that. Again, more like a UK context, I suppose. But I guess in times of scarcity, the first thing to go, or when services are being cut, are specialized services, often LGBT services. And so that's community centers, that's kind of specialized healthcare. And so I guess when I'm thinking about our greatest challenges, it's are people, members of our community that are most marginalized, having access to the things that they need. And connecting that to the social media point, I think it's a beautiful thing that we're able to connect with a kind of a global community in a way that's really intimate that we weren't before. But I think what it takes away from is actually a lot of the lived realities of people in the margins of our community. And I think a lot of the times, the debates that are happening online or the focus of the conversation aren't actually maybe embedded in the lived reality of a lot of the people in our community. I get on the like more global level, obviously it's like a crime to be gay, homosexual in lots of different, like around 70 countries. And so that's obviously something important to bring in, but also I guess talking about the intersection of people having kind of an experience of migration, the experience of when kind of refugees come to countries that are decrimmed, and their experience in the detention centers and then being like sent back, and like how can we incorporate that conversation as well. But kind of what Nim was saying, it's a really big question, because then we're in the territory of like really interrogating kind of racism and transphobia, capitalism, like climate breakdown, and how that impacts kind of frontline communities, which is often, and most marginalized and oppressed communities, which is often queer people of color. So it's a really big question, like it's a very big question. But yeah, that's why I'll leave it there. But yeah, I'll see if anyone has anything to add.
Yeah, I think I both agree with you that there's a lot of different challenges that we're facing, and all of these issues do connect and relate to each other in ways which sometimes we don't even realize. And I think, especially in places like the UK, where I partly live as well, in Iceland, you know, these countries are very, very different when it comes down to how LGBT issues are discussed, and in particular trans issues. And there's a vast difference between how things are portrayed in the media, for example. And I think looking at both of these countries as an example, even though they're very different and there's a completely different climate in Iceland, the same sort of criticism, arguments, and the same things is still coming up even in Iceland. So I think it's interesting to see how these differences translate between different countries, even though you come in completely different cultural contexts. So I think thinking about that and how we move forward, and even within the queer community, we have very different ideas about how to advance advocacy and how to talk about LGBT issues, and what is the most impactful way to do so. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about the difference of activism and framing and messaging, and how we as a community even can also come together and find a way to sort of unite and find solidarity in those messages in a more impactful way.
Yeah, I mean, I can kick that one off if you want. Yeah, when I think about tracking kind of the history of the LGBT community globally, and then push that back like a few decades, again, a big question, but also there is like a common thread throughout it all. So kind of the idea of explicitly or implicitly the media talking about kind of our community as kind of perverse, that we're kind of a threat or a burden to the healthcare system, often using us as scapegoats or ways to distract from actually real issues. And I guess, and kind of I touched on it before, but this idea that the first specialized services to go are often kind of LGBT services to local authorities and things like that. And how can we think about kind of rallying around that? I guess like really leaning into that, there's a shared history amongst the different segments of a community and trying to find the lines of solidarity in that. So I guess what's really important to me and what's been really important for my journey in finding solidarity within our communities is doing the self-work to understand how my struggle is bound up with kind of my trans brothers and sisters and non-binary folk, and really do the work to understand how my struggle is intertwined with theirs. And once you kind of do that work and start working outwards, you start developing a practice whereby you start in your organizing spaces, that experience comes out, as well as the messaging and the way that you formalize your campaigns, as well as the way that you lobby. I'm trying to find a way to ground that in like more like an example, but I don't know if you want to come in to kind of help me out.
Sure. What a great act of queer solidarity.
Throwing you in there.
Coming in to save you, no, I'm joking. Yeah, no, when I think about this a lot, and actually I think in the UK around trans rights, so much of this conversation right now is based on messaging. And so I'm thinking about this all the time. And I think when I look back through the last couple of decades of gay rights movements, lesbian rights movements, bi and trans rights movements and so on, there's always been tensions around messaging. And I think that really what that's often been about is different perspectives on how to make change. And because the change that we're trying to make is for ourselves and our own safety, then what often ends up happening is people who are most safe, which doesn't mean that they are safe, but most safe in our communities, are closer to doors of power. So closer to positions of political lobbying, closer to positions of safety in labour and work, healthcare, and so on and so forth. And so an approach that often wins is that people most close to power, who are usually cis, white, middle class, non-disabled, and so on, have quicker access in our long-term struggles for rights. And so there's two kind of approaches to change there. One is to say, we'll get the first foot in the door and you can get yours later, which is often what happens in queer community. The other is to recognise that none of us really get full rights and liberation until everybody does. And so actually, if we start with people most harmed and most marginalised, then we bring up the spirit level for everybody at the same time. And I see this in messaging a lot. And so as examples, in the UK, I mean, if we look back historically around Kennedy, you brought up the kind of view of us as perverse, and I'd go as far as to say gayness is a disease. And then when you saw that correlate in messaging and platform with HIV and AIDS, when there was a literal disease associated with being gay, that frame against us sped up. And I think in the 90s, what you saw was some gay lobbies distancing themselves from HIV and AIDS, rather than saying, we deserve healthcare, help us. And so I think that kind of like when you start to see parts of a community distance themselves from the respectability or disrespectability of some of the frames that are used against us, that's when we start to get into trouble. And so around trans rights at the moment, one of the ways that anti-trans activists are really targeting trans people, for example, is through prisons and pitching in their language women and trans women prisoners against each other. And an easy frame to pick up here that would win quite quickly is one that reinforces law and order, one that says people who deserve to be punished should be punished, and XYZ about trans people. But the problem is, I think, that doesn't work for trans people long term, because trans people as a community are over-policed, over-criminalised, and are going to interact far more with the criminal justice system than non-trans people within the community, particularly when you start laying in other aspects of race and disability, etc. in there. I think we also see it with sex work, and elements of trans and non-trans community, trying to kind of host conversations or create messaging for young trans people about respectability of jobs that they can aspire to. Right. And in the moment, I think that feels good to people because it's about saying there's a whole option. There's a whole host of options and we're supporting you. But what it actually does is re-stigmatize sex work. And so I think in this conversation about messaging, that's often what I'm thinking about around framing and messaging is the strategy get some people rights first and then everybody else can climb up the ladder later? Or is it let's recognize that none of us really truly have rights? We're not truly seen as not a threat until everyone has rights.
I guess like something that made me think about was every year at Pride, at least in the UK, there's a conversation around whether the police should march in the Pride parade. It's like a whole thing. And I think that's like a very good example of that. Because, for example, if you're centering kind of the middle class, white, gay man experience, having police at Pride, I mean, in the modern day, isn't that much of a big deal, actually. But if you're actually centering the experience of trans folk or black queer folk, then that actually becomes a bigger issue, basically, and you have to kind of reckon with that. And you also, as like if you're organizing a Pride in London, have to make the decision of whose experience you're going to prioritize. Because obviously for me, for example, I know a lot of my people I'm in community with would feel less safe having police at Pride. And so when you're deciding to have them there, you're actively centering a different experience by allowing the police to march at Pride as just one example of that. And I think what it also does is this thing called like pink washing. It's kind of like the idea that the police can use queerness or the LGBT community to kind of rehabilitate their reputation by associating themselves with Pride. But what that can do is actually undermine a lot of anti-racist work that's happening towards the police by being like, oh, it's okay that we're kind of disproportionately policing Black communities because we show up at Pride events. And so actually in that real example, how can you show solidarity by not only not allowing potentially the police not to march in Pride, but to be actually like, the reason that you're not here is because of these reasons, and until you transform, reform, you're not welcome here, essentially. So that's what that made me think of as a very like quite a tangible example of when you're doing messaging, when you're kind of formulating the image for an event or your community, what experiences you're centering and how do you build outwards from there.
Yeah, I think all of these things you're saying is very relevant to the Icelandic community as well, because there have been discussions in the past few years about Pride and about pink washing and about the police, and there have been lots of different thoughts and ideas and sort of approaches that people have to this, and I think it's a relevant conversation. And Iceland historically is a very white country and is also a very, very cis country, like most countries, obviously. But I think Iceland often is quite naive when it comes down to issues of racism in particular. So I think these conversations are finally starting in Iceland, which is really good, and our community is expanding as well. So I think it's really, really good that you mention these things, because it's an ongoing conversation in Iceland right now and will be for the next few years at least, I believe. But I wanted to touch a bit about what you were saying, Nim, about these messaging and what you see happening in the media, because we work quite extensively together on trans rights, and we've been working on framing and how to sort of deal with what's happening, in particular in the UK right now. And they're becoming quite renowned in the European context for being a really, really transphobic media climate there. And what I see when I moved to the UK about 5 years ago, I was actually quite shocked by how not just anti-trans, but anti-LGBT the UK is in the media. And it wasn't until 2003 that you were allowed to talk about being gay, lesbian, bi, and trans in schools, which to Iceland seems really, really, really outlandish. So I just kind of wanted to pick up upon, how can we as a community think about those messages, because a lot of the messages I see in the UK are kind of reactionary, and they don't really think of the bigger picture. And a lot of the sort of slogans we have, which we think as a community are great, aren't always delivering to the wider community. The biggest example I can think of is the slogan, trans women are women, trans men are men, and non-binary people are, and then people are unsure about what should come there, whether it's non-binary people or non-binary or non-binary people are valid. And you kind of end up excusing being who you are with those slogans. I mean, these slogans are great. And I raise my hand and I scream them when we're doing parades. But what do these messages actually achieve? Because people get confused by them, even though we think they are quite obvious, and of course they are true. But how can we think of messages which reach those people who don't know anything about being trans or being gay or bisexual or whatever it is? How can we work together to create those messages which are more impactful?
I think that's a great question. And I think the honest answer is it's hard, and it's hard to do it collectively because we all have different needs, relationships to the message, and proximity to kind of the violence and harm that's being caused in the moment. I think one of the reasons, I think the slogan you used is a really good example of one that actually I think is long-term harmful to our community, but with all the best intentions. Because actually there's this phrase in messaging, obviously, I know you know this very well, but there's a phrase that we use in messaging speak, which is don't name the elephant. And that when you repeat back the core message of somebody else's messaging against you, what you actually do is reinforce their message against you. And so in saying trans women are women, trans men are men, non-binary are valid or non-binary, actually what a lot of people hear is, oh, trans women are different to women, trans women are different to men, trans women are not valid. Non-binary people are not valid. But there's a desire there. I think it comes from a desire to give people easy sound bites to chant back, to fight back with, which is obviously great. And I think, again, like I said, some of the easy messaging to pick up right now. So the areas that in the UK we're really being tacked on around trans issues is sports, prisons, young people, and so on. And it's very easy to think about what's the easiest message that lands with a lot of people in this work. And so, as I said, law and order messaging for prisons is very easy, or picking up sorry, my mind's just gone blank on examples, but I think sometimes our desire at the other end of the spectrum, sorry, I've lost my train of thought, I'll come back to it. At the other end of the spectrum are people being really day-to-day directly harmed and hurt by these messages. And so rightfully in a movement, when you're hurt, your position isn't to make nice messaging, it's to be angry. And that's completely valid and a human response to being attacked and under attack. And so we have this kind of huge spectrum from feeling the really immediate pain of a moment a message is used against you, through to let's appeal to the least accepting part of wider society so that they accept some of us. And in that, you then get a lot of inter-community conflict. And really, I think one of the things we don't talk enough about in community and our relationships to how we reach people is our own trauma and pain, and the ways that shapes things. Because I think sometimes when you get people at the end of the spectrum who want quick and easy messaging, it's because you're looking very quickly for safety. But what's actually happening, which is a painful thing to talk about, is your safety is coming ahead of other people's safety. And so how do you balance those things? And I think, I don't think there's easy answers to that, because on the one hand, I don't think you've really got a social movement unless there's lots of different voices and different types of voices in conversation with each other, challenging each other. If everybody thought the same way as me, obviously I think the world would be great and we'd be in a much better position, but it wouldn't actually be.
Please do everything you want to do, Nim, and we'll be great.
But actually, like, the reality is I've got stuff to learn from other people and I don't experience everything, and I'm naive to the areas that I don't recognize I cause harm, or that the messages that I think are good cause other people harm. And so being in conversation and dialogue with each other, I think, is a really core part of this. But all of that said, my opinion that I think is right is that we do need to speak to wider audiences. We need to not just speak to people who already think we're valid and repeat chants that say we're valid to people who already agree with us, because that doesn't move people who don't think we're valid. And I think we have to avoid picking up frames and messaging that also reaffirms fundamentally heteronormative, homophobic, transphobic, sex worker-phobic, HIV-phobic messages around things like respectable work or law and order, or you know, all the other things that kind of that end of the spectrum. And what I think we really need to be doing is really thinking at this moment in time in the movement where we are now, most people in the UK are passively supporting us, but get completely inundated with messages against us, and particularly trans women and how awful trans women are. And so if we want to keep people on side and actively on side, we have to speak to that passive support. And we have to do it in a way that doesn't reaffirm the things that in 5 years' time, then all we have is lots of middle-class white trans men and women in lots of positions of power, and the rest of the community is still left far behind.
Yeah. And there's a challenge in that, right? So the idea of like not throwing anybody under the bus while also appealing to a wider audience is the challenge, and the work of like someone that works in comms and messaging, because there are so many lazy tropes just laying around to be picked up, kind of the respectability trope, or like kind of the good queer and the bad queer, and kind of like pitting people against each other. Because I'm actually really curious to know what your opinion is of this, Nim, because like when I think about like historically, like probably like 70s, 80s, 90s, a lot of the slogan was like, you probably have a brother or a husband that's gay, and they can use that as a reference in their brain, or like their like cousin may be gay or something like that, to kind of ground the experience in their day-to-day lives and be like, oh yeah, I have someone that's affecting my life in this way. And so the messaging can be a bit more personal and grounded in real life. But I guess there are less out trans people in the population, and so with that, how then can we have messaging, and how can other people in the LGBT community act in more real solidarity in their day-to-day life to bring that alive for their family members? Yeah. Because often when I'm talking to distant relatives, they won't know anyone that's trans, and so like there's a question there around actually messaging being more vital than ever because of that kind of very material and practical numbers game, but also a very real existence, that you know, trans people actually exist, but they're actually talked about as if they're not. And I think actually, yeah, I wanted to respond to that, but there's also something about people getting really stuck on debating symbolism or symbols, yeah, and that distracting from actually the real lived reality of it. So the idea, for example, if you take like teaching LGBT lessons in school, everyone has a massive debate of that happening. LGBT people exist, relationships exist. So what are you talking about? But actually, it's not actually about the lessons themselves. It's about kind of like the symbol of having a lesson in the classroom that people latch onto. And the same with like gender neutral toilets, et cetera, et cetera. But those are the two things that made me think of.
Yeah. And I think sorry.
No, you go ahead.
I was going to say, I think that's really important, because I think we get stuck in conversations, exactly as you're saying, Kennedy, about like symbolic things sometimes that we didn't even ask for, but other people have on our behalf. And then meanwhile, like in London, I can't remember the exact stat, but it's something like 80% of homeless young people are LGBT. And not bringing these conversations back to what's the actual material lives of LGBT people. It just means that we end up in these conversations other people have set for us. And so having those conversations, I think, on our terms is really important. I also think there's the thing that you raised about the kind of your brother, your friend, etc. I think what's interesting to me about that, and what I think about often in terms of where we are in the UK and the trans hellscape that we're in right now, is that in the 80s and kind of 80s, 90s, and obviously prior for decades, the real kind of violent anti-gay sentiment was such that there were obviously a lot more gay people than were recorded, but many people weren't out. And I think part of why the messaging started to work around your brother, your son, your friend, etc., is because the gay rights movement and the hardline activist, hardcore parts of the gay rights movement spoke up. And and often so that more people were able to come out, so that more people knew and realized that they had gay partners, even, let alone gay brothers and parents and sisters, etc. And so that human connection absolutely was part of it. And I think that's part of why we have to be strategic with our messaging, because 3 years ago, the two main lines that came out about trans rights with good intention were trans rights are human rights and trans lives are not up for debate. And I think the fundamental issue with those messages at that moment in time is that they assumed that we were in the same time, that enough groundwork had been done by trans activists or LGBT activists that they were messages that would hold in society in the way that a few years prior, love is love held for gay marriage. But it misunderstood that the love is love slogan worked at that point because of the decades of work of gay rights activists that had shifted the social landscape and created a space in which more gay people had come out preceding that. Yeah. And so I hope there's a point in time when this conversation is redundant and we can say things like, trans lives are not up for debate and people actually, it matters. But at the moment, our lives are up for debate. And if we're not at the table, we're on the menu. So we like that slogan won't hold.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I definitely think there's a lot of, we were talking about earlier here at the event, there was a conversation between older chairmen of the National Queer Organization, and they were talking about the sort of different challenges that they faced. And a lot of them said that, what they see trans and intersex people now and those people who belong to the more marginalized groups going through is exactly what they were going through back in the day. So I think, when we talk about the trans community, we quite aren't there yet, even though we are there a bit further for gay, lesbian, and bisexual people. But I think, when we're still in this place of people not seeing trans people fundamentally as who they are, there's a lot of groundwork that needs to be done before, as we say, those messages can start to have the impact we want them to have. But I also wanted to talk about trauma, because I think this is a big thing that always comes up and something the queer community doesn't even acknowledge and talk about in their own community, because trauma can affect so many things in our lives, whether that's our professional life, our personal life, or how we treat each other as a community. And I think there's a lot of trauma from previous generations that still hasn't been worked through. And I think that trauma carries on today. And there's a lot of trauma that people who are growing up now experience, which the older generations did not in the same way. And I sort of wanted to talk about how trauma affects our communication as a community, because often we have quite heated and we clash and there's a lot of conflict between us. And I sort of wanted to talk about the role of trauma in that and how we as a community can sort of acknowledge the trauma between those different generations and who we are and what we all went through without putting each other down and without disrespecting each other and what we've gone through. And I think this has been a discussion in Iceland that I would like to open up a bit more about how trauma affects us. So I don't know how you two feel about that. Maybe Nim wants to start?
Yeah, I think about this a lot and all the time. And one of the things Kennedy mentions he does, which I also do, is train activists and campaigners in spaces where we intentionally open up the space for people from completely different campaign and life experience backgrounds into a space together, often pre-COVID for a week at a time. And instead of trying to create a kind of nice superficial culture, we really, have a space for activists to talk about their real work, and that carries trauma with it. And so how do you support movements of people where there is often so much trauma? And I think that is absolutely true, kind of painfully true for LGBT communities across generations. And I think one of the fundamental issues or struggles, and that comes back to the first question about this idea of community, and that actually we're rarely in community with each other. And one of the key ways that we confront and support trauma in our communities is to be in community, whether it's with each other, with other people, but creating support structures that were denied to us before is part of that answer. But often what we have is lots of traumatized people trying to provide those structures to each other. And I think that's the crux of what we don't often talk about. When I think about this in terms of like intergenerational conversations and trauma, there are two things I think of one, first of all, is building out of that space of needing to kind of create conversation, as you're saying, Ugla, and like really leaning into that conversation together about what that is, but really deeply understanding how much of it we all carry. And I think about this in terms of myself and the ways that my trauma has oriented me towards doing things that, or feeling things that I've had to challenge myself on. And growing up, as you said, it wasn't until 2003 that we were allowed to talk about being LGBT in school. And I'm the generation who grew up under Section 28, which is the kind of legal framework that prevented anybody from talking about being gay at school. I grew up in a time when I'd sneak out to gay clubs in my teen years, and you'd have to be really careful and always leave in a group because there would sometimes be people outside ready to beat you up. And these days, in the last few years, I wouldn't say I do it anymore, but I think I've definitely had moments where I felt a bit like, who are all these new like queers coming into queer space who have just decided now that they're queer because it's easy? Like, where were they when we were fighting on the streets? And I've had to really challenge myself on that and say that trauma shouldn't be the magic key that allows you into queer community. What were we fighting for if not for people to be able to just decide tomorrow that they are gay? Like, that's absolutely the thing we were fighting for. And I think when I unpacked that for myself, what I started to realize is what was painful was the lack of recognition or conversation about the amount of trauma some of us still really carry from fighting for that space. And I think that speaks to the kind of depoliticization often of our communities and our conversations. And I wish there were more spaces for political education and intergenerational conversation in our communities where we build meaningful relationships with each other, where we can actually understand what each other has been through or is going through now. And I think often, part of the reason we don't have that is in fact a trauma response, because we shut down. And when we shut down, we get protective of what we have and where we feel safe, instead of opening up and trying to connect collectively and build solidarity and understanding between us.
Ooh, yeah.
Sorry, I talk too much.
Oh, no, like preach. I'm here for it. What I would say is the action, it's difficult. I think part of me basically wants to give props to kind of the queer community for being able to hold community, because I think relatively in some pockets we're actually very good at it. But what I'll also say is that I think over the last few decades, like one of the reasons that I set up with a couple of my friends, kin, to bring community together was because actually culturally and economically, we have been stripped of our ability to form community, to know what it is to be in community, to say that actually conflict's not a bad thing. That's actually part of how you grow together. Like, I think we've just lost some of the fundamental skills to build community. And it's actually a relearning process to do that, which is why intergenerational conversations are really important, because there's so much to learn from, there's so much, a wealth of knowledge there from our histories to do that within. I guess the other thing that I would say, and I think this speaks to kind of a bit what you were saying about the depoliticization of the intergeneration conversation, is to say that actually through the lens of being more political, you can track a very important history of practice of change making, of resilience through the intergenerational conversation. Is another thing that I thought of, and I guess the last thing would be morale. So like, when I'm in a space and I am being affirmed by someone that's like 20, 30 years older than me, being like, I had a very similar experience to you, that can keep my activism going and my organizing going for a very long time, to be honest. Just because it feels like such a rarity to have that in the space. In terms of being able to kind of process trauma in in real life when you're in community, I think it just takes a lot of intentional self-work and being willing to do that. It's kind of like you can't force someone to drink water. You can bring them to the river. What? I don't know what I'm saying. But like, it's the idea that basically like people have to be ready to deal with their own trauma and their own history before they can actually have space to kind of not have those kind of trauma responses. But what I will say in that is that we have to have the resources and capacity in community to do that for each other. Like that doesn't happen in isolation. It only ever happens in community, I believe, which is something that is lacking in lots of queer spaces. But I think there's definitely pockets where we do that very, very well with very little resource. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that relates pretty well to what Samtaka and Samtaka do, who have a great service of counselors for queer people, which are accessible free for anyone who's queer in any way that wants to access it, because I think it's really important to have that access and have those people within the community who understand your experience. So I'm just using the opportunity to plug the counseling service for Samtaka and Samtaka. But we have about 15 more minutes before I say goodbye. So I'm going to encourage people who are watching to send us questions in either via our Facebook inbox or on Instagram, and I will be looking at these questions. But meanwhile, I'm going to ask you one other question, and that is sort of about unity and solidarity and why it's so important that we come together from all of these different places and how we can do that. I mean, to me, the answer is quite obvious, but it's always good to hear other people's opinions and views on solidarity and unity. So maybe we can start off with Kennedy this time.
Yeah, sure. I think about solidarity quite often. And solidarity to me is basically the work of understanding how you move through the world and how you are kind of oppressed, and then doing the work to understand what are the similarities between how you are and other groups are. So then you recognize that actually your liberation is tied up in other people's, and actually that as being like quite a tangible strategy. It's like love is great, marriage equality, thumbs up, but we still have lots of trans women of color having violence against them at disproportionate rates. So what went wrong there? And I think it is a question of like understanding and centering questions around solidarity and what it means to have that in relation to other people and groups. I mean, a really good example of that that I like talking about is Lesbian and Gay Support the Miners, which was a group that started in the 1980s in the UK that was formed to support the miners' strike in 1983 that lasted for a year. When the miners' strike against pit closures, because factory wanted to close, and it would have meant that loads of jobs would have been lost, a lot of livelihoods would have been screwed over. And this group was formed to basically raise money for the miners. And it was very transformational in terms of solidarity, because at the time, LGBT people were incredibly oppressed and vilified. But they recognized that actually the same media that is saying that they're perverse, that they are kind of demonizing them essentially, are doing the same things to the miners. So they have a common cause. And so we're going to support them because we have the same, we're being oppressed in the same way. And actually their liberation is bound up in ours. If we can build power with this group of people, we stand a better chance of getting free. And so that for me is what it means to kind of stand in solidarity across the board with kind of people that have a migration experience, with trans folk, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. And I think the thing that I would add is just, I think, again, coming back to problematizing this word community, because I think often we say that we have queer community and what we have is a queer clique or a queer social scene. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's fine to have a queer clique as a group of friends where you support each other. It's fine to have a queer social scene. But I think what turns something from a scene to a community is that there are people who are different than you in it. There are people who do think differently. There is outward challenge and sometimes conflict, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's part of what being in community with each other is. But recognizing you have a shared investment or a shared resource with each other. And I think sometimes when your identity is the thing that you are organizing community or spaces around, we start to treat that like home. And I think for queer people or LGBTQ plus people especially, a lot of our trauma comes from being rejected from home. And so the stakes become so high when we find a new home with each other. But sometimes our political spaces can't be our home. And so I think really interrogating who is your home. I don't mean literal home. It might be your bio family. You might be lucky and it might not. But who is that and who is your community and how are those two things different? And where's your scene? And then beyond that, I I'm not going to repeat everything you just said because of time, but also because you said it so well. But I think being in solidarity and understanding how our lives are connected to everybody else's and working together through that is really, relationship is really the key, I think, of all of our liberation, building relationship.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, I think we could go on all day about solidarity and these things, because it's really important, and it's really important that we, as a community, as you said, are aware that we are different in the community, but that doesn't mean that we can't show solidarity and unify and come together. I have a question through that says, can we talk about the use of humor in messaging, for example, and how and whether humor is useful when we are framing and when we're trying to get messages out there? I mean, I use humor sometimes in my messaging a lot, but I wonder what you think about how useful humor can be in this context.
I love humor. You might not understand that from this conversation, but I do. I think it's really important, but I also think in messaging, if it's going out to an audience that you don't have a pre-existing relationship with, you should absolutely use it, and you need to be careful, because a joke that might be intra-community funny can sound snarky, and that can do the opposite of building support. Also, I think we should always be checking that our humor is not punching down and always punching up. But I think if we can find good ways to use humor, I think that's the best way often to get good messages out there. And I think sometimes because in social change work, we're often talking about issues that are painful, traumatic, etc. We feel like we have to stay in this emotion of pain or seriousness in communicating it. And actually trauma, I think, can be, oh my God, humor rather, can be as good a release for that as crying, and that we should use more of it.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm really happy that person brought it. But yeah, when I've scribbled down, make sure you're always kind of punching up, not down. I think that's really important. And I think humor just has a way of cutting through. I think it's no accident, basically, that queer people are the funniest people I know, because like growing up, often they have to use humor as a way to subvert kind of violence often. And so I think it's a really good tool in lots of different contexts and lots of different ways. And like Nim says, I think often, me and Nim organize together, we often try and create spaces that are full of joy, that are full of humor, because that is just as important as understanding the issue. And a very real part of the human experience that obviously we should be bringing to work at any like opportunity we have.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I use humor a lot in what I do. And I think I don't use it necessarily, when doing public things, but I use it a lot within the community to sort of process that trauma and to sort of, because if I wouldn't, I think I would be a lot more depressed than I am right now. So I think, that you need to use humor to sort of make the situation more tolerable, and I definitely use it a lot. But as you said, it is difficult to know how to use it and how that's going to land with the wider community. So using humor can work really well, but it needs to be done in the right way so it lands with people outside our community. We have about 5 minutes before I leave you, so I wanted to ask you a very quick question. So someone wanted to know a little bit about what you were talking earlier about trauma in specific, and how are there any good practices for us to help each other? How, for example, can a gay older man help a young trans woman or a non-binary person today?
That is a good question. I think it's really tough question, because like all of it's always context-based. Often, I mean, I'm gonna think very practically, but often when we're in a space and we're having a difficult conversation, I'm gonna be very practical. Our nervous systems become activated, like it's true. And so often in those moments when we're having those difficult conversations, there's a lot of practices that you can do to help ground yourself back into the space. Often kind of bringing humor, breathing exercises, cliche, but it works. There's a reason why yoga is so pervasive. What else is there? There's also kind of just having an awareness of what's going on in your body and having kind of very bodily practices and being embodied in your practice when you're running a workshop. And I also would say signpost to kind of professionals as well, and having those resources and access, like what resources are available where you can signpost them to.
Yeah, I think I would completely agree with that. I think the two things I'd add is, in addition to the resources piece, is that parts of community that have access to more resource, more money, etc., fund solidarity group, like create a solidarity fund for access to trans support groups, or find where there are already. I mean, in the UK, there's more and more popping up self-run trans therapy groups, trans support groups, crowdfunds, etc. Like, actually put resource into it, whether that's access to space you have for people to organize in, or money to therapy, etc. I think the other thing is really being trauma informed. I think the first step of being trauma informed is understanding that in a space with a community that disproportionately experiences trauma, there is going to be trauma in the space. And I know that sounds obvious, but I feel like we don't act that way sometimes. And as Kennedy says, our nervous systems, our bodies get physically triggered, and often we're not even aware that that's what's happening to us. And so having an awareness that when we interact with each other as traumatized people, we are all always having reactions that often are connected to our bodies and the traumas that we carry with us. And holding space for that, understanding that somebody's response might seem disproportionate in a moment, but is connected to wider experiences of oppression that people experience, and creating spaces that are more compassionate, slower, and really, I mean, I feel like I'm repeating myself, but I think fundamentally, again, it comes back to building relationship. It comes back to knowing people. Not, you know, if you walk up to somebody and say, I think you're being triggered right now, they're probably going to punch you in the face. Like, it's not about trying to like do something to somebody else or for somebody else. It's about building relationship and meaningful space together, so that you have that support system with each other.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Kennedy and Nim. I'm really, really excited and glad we had this chat, because I think a lot of people benefited hugely from it. So thank you for being with us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for hosting us, Ugla.
Takk fyrir þetta, Ugla og félagar, margir áhugaverðir punktar þarna, og við erum hvergi nær hættir á þessu málþingi Samtaka til framtíðar og þessari aðalfunda helgi Samtakana 78. Hér eftir smástund það tónlistaratriði. Elín ætlar að koma og flytja okkur ljúfa tóna, en fyrst smá pása. Farið ekki langt.